In the frozen winter of 1941, a column of Soviet trucks struggled through the snow on the outskirts of Moscow. One by one, the ZIS-5 vehicles sputtered and died, their engines unable to handle the brutal cold and the demands of war. Soviet soldiers pushed the broken trucks to the roadside, cursing their fate. The Red Army was fighting for its life against the Nazi invasion, and their own trucks were failing them at the worst possible moment. Little did these soldiers know that help was coming from across the Atlantic Ocean, help that would transform the entire nature of Soviet warfare and ultimately change the course of history. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more fascinating stories from World War II history. The story of American trucks in Soviet hands begins not with military strategy, but with industrial arithmetic. When Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941, the Wehrmacht rolled into the Soviet Union with confidence. German intelligence had carefully calculated Soviet capabilities based on their truck production numbers. What they didn't know, what nobody could have predicted, was that American industrial might was about to multiply Soviet logistics capacity by a factor that would shatter all German assumptions about how fast and how far the Red Army could strike. The Lend-Lease program started as a political lifeline. President Franklin Roosevelt understood that supporting the Allies was essential to American security, even before the United States officially entered the war. House Resolution 1776, introduced on February 10, 1941, became law in March of that year. The symbolic number was no accident. This was America's new declaration of independence, a statement that democracy would not fall to fascism without a fight. But the real genius of Lend-Lease wasn't in its political symbolism. It was in what America chose to send and how they sent it. When Soviet procurement officers first met with American manufacturers, they came with shopping lists focused on weapons, tanks, aircraft, artillery pieces. The Americans listened politely, then suggested something else. Trucks, lots of trucks. The Soviets were skeptical. They needed weapons to stop the panzers, not cargo vehicles. But American advisors understood something the Soviets hadn't fully grasped yet. Modern warfare wasn't won by the army with the most tanks. It was won by the army that could keep its tanks fueled, its guns loaded, and its soldiers fed 500 kilometers from the nearest railroad. The Studebaker Corporation of South Bend, Indiana, became an unlikely hero of the Eastern Front. Before the war, Studebaker made comfortable civilian automobiles for American families. In 1941, they retooled their factories to produce the US-6, a 2.5-ton 6x6 truck designed specifically for military logistics. The US-6 wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fast, it wasn't armed, but it was exactly what the Red Army needed, even if they didn't know it yet. The first Studebakers arrived in the Soviet Union in autumn 1941 through the Arctic convoys, those desperate runs through U-boat-infested waters where merchant sailors faced death by freezing or drowning with every voyage. Soviet drivers who took delivery of these first American trucks treated them with suspicion. The vehicles looked different from Soviet models. The controls were labeled in English. The engines required higher quality fuel and oil than Soviet trucks. Some Red Army officers wondered if accepting these vehicles was worth the trouble. Then they drove them, and everything changed. Lieutenant Pavel Gurevich of the 6th Separate Guards Mortar Battalion later recalled his first encounter with a Studebaker. His unit had been struggling with ZIS-5 trucks, two-axle vehicles that got stuck in mud and required constant maintenance. The ZIS was adequate on paved roads, but the Eastern Front had precious few paved roads. Most of Soviet territory was mud in spring and autumn, dust in summer, and ice in winter. The ZIS-5 handled none of these conditions well. The Studebaker, by contrast, was an all-terrain monster. Six-wheel drive meant it could claw through conditions that would stop a Soviet truck dead. The engine was powerful and reliable, and it had a feature that seemed almost magical to Soviet soldiers: a steel cable winch mounted above the front bumper. Signalman Semyon Brevdo witnessed what this winch meant in practical terms. Soviet truck columns would bog down in mud, and soldiers would spend hours digging out vehicles by hand, sometimes abandoning trucks entirely when they couldn't be freed. A Studebaker could anchor its winch cable to a tree or another vehicle and pull itself out of mud that would have swallowed a Soviet truck. Even better, one or two Studebakers in a column could pull out all the other vehicles. What Brevdo called the difference between success and failure often came down to whether American trucks were present. But the real transformation wasn't happening on muddy roads in Russia. It was happening in the deserts of Persia, modern-day Iran, where American engineers were building a logistics corridor that would astound Soviet observers and ultimately deliver nearly half of all American aid to the USSR. The Persian Corridor was one of the great engineering achievements of World War II, yet it remains largely unknown outside specialist histories. When the Arctic convoys proved too dangerous and the Pacific route too limited, the Allies needed another path to get supplies to the Soviet Union. Iran provided the answer, but first it required a complete infrastructure overhaul. American engineers arrived in a country where camel paths substituted for highways and discovered they needed to essentially rebuild transportation from scratch. They constructed highways where none existed. They built assembly plants in the desert capable of processing 300 trucks daily. The facility at Andemek became legendary among Soviet liaison officers. Trucks arrived in crates, and American workers assembled them with speed that seemed impossible to observers accustomed to Soviet industrial practices. Soviet drivers would complete grueling journeys from the Caucasus, receive 3 days of training on American vehicles, then drive their new Studebakers north into combat zones. The efficiency stunned everyone who witnessed it. American dock operations unloaded ships in 48 hours, tasks that took Soviet ports 2 weeks. Soviet logistics officers wrote detailed reports to Moscow about what they were seeing, trying to understand how Americans achieved such productivity. The answers were complex, involving everything from standardized parts to assembly line techniques, to a management philosophy that empowered workers to solve problems rather than waiting for orders from above. Soviet officers studied these methods, tried to replicate them, but lacked the industrial infrastructure and organizational culture to match American efficiency. By 1943, the flood of American vehicles was transforming Red Army capabilities in ways that German intelligence completely failed to anticipate. Wehrmacht planners had calculated Soviet offensive potential based on Soviet truck production, which was limited and struggling. German officers knew exactly how far Soviet forces could advance before logistics would force an operational pause. Their estimates assumed Soviet armies needed to stop every 100 to 150 kilometers to rebuild supply lines. These calculations had been reliable for the first 2 years of the war. Then, suddenly, they weren't. Operation Bagration, in summer 1944, shattered German assumptions about Soviet mobility. The Red Army offensive in Belarus advanced 450 kilometers in 5 weeks, a pace that German planning considered impossible for Soviet forces. Wehrmacht intelligence officers desperately tried to understand what had changed. The answer was rolling on American wheels. During those 5 weeks, American trucks in Soviet service carried 400,000 tons of ammunition, 300,000 tons of food, and evacuated 250,000 wounded soldiers. They consumed 67,000 tons of fuel, itself delivered largely by other American trucks. The arithmetic was crushing for German defenders. A single Soviet rifle division in attack required 450 tons of supplies daily. Multiply that across dozens of divisions conducting simultaneous offensives, and the logistical demands became astronomical. Soviet production couldn't meet these needs. From January to September 1943, Soviet factories produced 49,000 vehicles. American deliveries in the same period totaled 94,000. Without American trucks, Soviet forces couldn't operate beyond 50 kilometers from rail lines, a limitation that would have made deep offensive operations impossible. Don't forget to leave a comment below telling us what aspect of World War II history you'd like us to cover next. Your suggestions help shape our content. The marriage of American trucks to Soviet weapon systems created some of the war's most feared combinations. The Katyusha rocket launcher had become a symbol of Soviet firepower, but its effectiveness depended entirely on mobility. The original BM-13 launchers mounted on Soviet ZIS-6 trucks were powerful, but slow. After firing a salvo, the ZIS required 15 minutes to relocate, time that allowed German counter-battery fire to find and eliminate the launcher. Mount the same Katyusha on a Studebaker, and everything changed. The American truck could fire its rockets and relocate within 3 minutes, a speed that made counter-battery fire nearly impossible. German soldiers called them Stalin's organs for the distinctive sound of the rockets in flight, but they noted with grim irony that these organs of destruction rode on American trucks. The BM-3112 variant, nicknamed Andriusha, was specifically designed for the Studebaker chassis. Soviet engineers appreciated that the American truck's robust construction could handle the stress of rocket launches without breaking down, something Soviet vehicles struggled with. The psychological impact on German troops matched the physical destruction. When Wehrmacht soldiers saw Studebaker-mounted Katyushas, they knew they were facing an enemy with virtually unlimited mobility and firepower. The Red Army that had fought desperately in 1941 and 1942, often on foot or with horse-drawn artillery, had become a fully mechanized force that could sustain offensive operations across 1,000-mile fronts. This transformation happened in less than 2 years, a timeline that would have been impossible without American industrial support. In Tehran, in November 1943, the Big Three Allied leaders met to coordinate strategy. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated military commander, stood at an embassy window watching trucks roll past, carrying supplies for the conference. The distinctive rumble of Studebaker engines filled the Persian air. In that moment, Zhukov confronted a truth that would remain classified in Soviet archives for nearly 50 years. The Red Army pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Berlin was rolling on American trucks, burning American fuel, eating American food. That evening, Stalin made a toast that was carefully recorded by both American stenographers and the NKVD, Soviet secret police. The Soviet leader stated that the American Studebaker was the best truck in the world for Soviet conditions and called it the foundation of Soviet mobility. Another Soviet officer was recorded saying, "One American truck is worth 10 light tanks to us," an extraordinary admission from military leaders who publicly credited only Soviet industry with victory. Yet, just 3 years later, in 1946, Stalin's tune had changed completely. With the wartime alliance dissolved and the Cold War beginning, Stalin publicly declared that Lend-Lease had been merely supplementary and represented only about 10% of Soviet production. This dramatic revision of history became official Soviet doctrine for the next 4 decades. Veterans who tried to speak honestly about American aid found themselves interrogated by the NKVD. Photographs showing American vehicles with Soviet markings were hidden away. Official histories credited Soviet victory entirely to Soviet efforts, erasing the contribution of 427,000 American trucks and jeeps. The truth remained buried until the Soviet collapse in 1991 opened previously classified archives. Researchers discovered dual bookkeeping systems, real statistics maintained for internal military planning, and false numbers released for public consumption. The real numbers were shocking. By 1945, American trucks comprised 70% of Soviet transport capacity. Dr. Boris Sokolov, examining these newly opened archives, reached a definitive conclusion. Remove American trucks from Soviet military inventory and every major offensive after Stalingrad fails. The Red Army simply couldn't have sustained the pace and scale of operations that drove Germany to defeat without American logistics support. The complete accounting revealed the staggering scope of American aid. Beyond the trucks, the United States delivered 2.7 million tons of petroleum products, 4.5 million tons of food, 15.4 million pairs of boots, and countless other items. Soviet soldiers ate American canned meat, the famous Tushanka that became a staple of Red Army rations. Soviet artillery fired shells using American gunpowder, roughly 50% of ammunition in 1942 and 1943. Even the steel for Soviet tanks included American materials. The Studebakers themselves became legendary among Soviet soldiers. Crews gave them affectionate nicknames. The Studer became a symbol of reliability in an army where mechanical breakdowns were routine. Unlike Soviet trucks that required constant tinkering and frequent replacement parts that weren't available, the Studebakers just worked. They started in cold that froze Soviet engines solid. They ran on lower quality fuel when necessary, though they preferred better petroleum products. They carried heavier loads than their rated capacity and kept running. In the swamps of Karelia, Finnish territory where the Red Army fought in the difficult terrain, Studebakers proved invaluable. Soviet trucks simply couldn't handle the waterlogged ground and endless mud. The American 6x6 clawed through conditions that stopped everything else. Drivers learned to love these vehicles, treating them with care that Soviet equipment rarely received. A Studebaker that was properly maintained would run for years. Soviet veterans recalled trucks that served through the entire war and were still running in the late 1950s. The versatility amazed Soviet logistics officers. The same basic truck platform served as an artillery tractor towing guns up to 150 millimeter caliber, a cargo hauler, a personnel carrier, a fuel tanker, and a platform for mounting repair workshops. Soviet engineers installed shortwave radio stations on Studebaker chassis, creating mobile communication centers that linked the general staff with frontline units. The robust American construction handled all these modifications without the frame failures that plagued Soviet vehicles when used beyond their original design specifications. After the war, most Studebakers were supposed to return to the United States under Lend-Lease agreements. Some did, many didn't. Soviet officials claimed trucks had been destroyed in combat or worn out beyond repair. The reality was that the USSR desperately needed vehicles for post-war reconstruction. Studebakers that survived the war continued serving in Soviet agriculture, industry, and the Army until the mid-1960s. Some remained in operation even longer in remote areas where their reputation for reliability made them too valuable to retire. Soviet veterans who had driven Studebakers formed the Studebaker Brotherhood after the Cold War ended, an organization dedicated to preserving the true history of American aid. These men had hidden photographs for 60 years, showing American vehicles with Soviet markings, afraid to display them during Stalin's era and beyond. In the 1990s, they finally brought out these images and their stories. 200 veterans signed a statement declaring, "We rode American trucks to victory. We ate American food." This simple truth had been classified information for half a century. On January 5, 1945, Lieutenant General Leonid Rudenko, head of the USSR Government Procurement Commission in the United States, presented the Studebaker Corporation with a photo album entitled "The Studebaker on the Soviet-German Front." The album contained images showing how the trucks served Soviet forces, a gesture of genuine gratitude from Soviet officials who understood what these vehicles had meant to their war effort. Today, that album resides in the archives of the Studebaker National Museum in South Bend, Indiana. a physical reminder of an alliance that changed history. The irony is profound. The Soviet Union, which prided itself on communist industrial planning and self-sufficiency, won its greatest military victory largely because of capitalist American mass production and logistics efficiency. The Red Army that planted the Soviet flag on the Reichstag in Berlin got there riding Roosevelt's trucks, as some historians have noted. This wasn't the narrative either side wanted to emphasize during the Cold War. Americans preferred to highlight their own combat contributions in Western Europe and the Pacific. Soviets insisted they had won the Great Patriotic War through their own efforts and sacrifices. The sacrifices were real and staggering. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in World War II, military and civilian. No amount of American trucks could diminish the courage of Red Army soldiers who fought the Wehrmacht in desperate battles from Stalingrad to Berlin. But courage without logistics is defeat. Soldiers can't fight without ammunition. Armies can't advance without fuel. The wounded die without evacuation. Food runs out. All the bravery in the world doesn't overcome these mathematical realities. What American trucks provided was the multiplication factor that turned Soviet manpower and determination into decisive victory. The Red Army had always had brave soldiers. What it gained from Lend-Lease was the ability to bring that bravery to bear across fronts spanning thousands of miles, to sustain offensives for weeks instead of days, to advance hundreds of kilometers instead of dozens before logistics forced a halt. German officers who became prisoners of war were interrogated about their defeat. Many mentioned Soviet mobility as a crucial factor, the ability of Red Army forces to appear in unexpected places with surprising speed and overwhelming force. Wehrmacht intelligence had calculated where Soviet attacks could and couldn't occur based on logistics limitations. Repeatedly in 1944 and 1945, Soviet forces attacked where German planning said they lacked the logistical capacity to operate. The answer to this puzzle was simple. German calculations assumed Soviet logistics capacity. American trucks had tripled that capacity, rendering all German assumptions obsolete. The Studebaker story reveals a larger truth about World War II that often gets overlooked in narratives focusing on heroic battles and dramatic turning points. Wars are won by industrial production and logistics as much as by soldiers and tactics. The Soviet Union could produce excellent tanks, particularly the T-34 that became legendary for its combination of firepower, armor, and mobility. But producing tanks wasn't enough. Those tanks needed fuel to run, ammunition to fight, and supply lines to sustain operations. Soviet industry struggled to provide these logistics fundamentals at the scale required for victory. American industry excelled at exactly this kind of mass production. The United States built Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. American factories produced aircraft by the tens of thousands, trucks by the hundreds of thousands, ammunition by the billions of rounds. This industrial tsunami overwhelmed Axis powers that had started the war with superior tactics and well-trained forces, but lacked the production capacity to sustain a long conflict against enemies who controlled vastly greater resources. The Persian Corridor demonstrated American engineering and organizational abilities that Soviet observers found almost incomprehensible. Building highways, ports, and assembly plants in the Iranian desert, then operating them with efficiency that tripled Soviet productivity, showcased advantages that went beyond material resources. American industrial culture emphasized standardization, interchangeable parts, continuous process improvement, and worker initiative in ways that Soviet command economy didn't replicate. When Soviet drivers received 3 days of training on Studebakers before driving them into combat, they were experiencing American assumptions about equipment design. The trucks were built to be operated by minimally trained personnel with controls and maintenance procedures designed for simplicity and reliability. Soviet vehicles, by contrast, often required experienced mechanics just to keep them running. This difference in design philosophy multiplied American effectiveness. A truck that any soldier could drive and maintain was worth several trucks that needed specialists. The story of Soviet forces using American logistics to defeat Nazi Germany contains lessons that extended far beyond World War II. During the Cold War, both superpowers built military forces based on assumptions about industrial mobilization and logistic sustainability. The Soviet experience in World War II should have taught that even the largest military couldn't operate effectively without robust logistics. Yet Soviet military planning often emphasized combat systems over support infrastructure, perhaps because acknowledging the importance of logistics would have meant acknowledging their dependence on American help during the war. American military doctrine, by contrast, made logistics central to combat effectiveness. The U.S. military that fought wars from Korea to present day has always maintained logistics capabilities that other nations found excessive. Critics called this logistical tale wasteful, noting that for every American combat soldier, several support personnel were required. But this approach reflected lessons learned in World War II. Forces with superior logistics can sustain operations that forces with limited logistics cannot, regardless of combat skill or courage. The men who drove Studebakers from Iran to Berlin, who maintained these trucks under combat conditions, who relied on them to evacuate wounded comrades and bring forward ammunition for the next attack, never forgot what these vehicles meant. Their testimony, finally recorded after decades of enforced silence, provides insight into how wars are actually won, not through dramatic heroics alone, though those matter, but through the unglamorous mathematics of tons of supplies delivered per day, kilometers advanced before logistical pause is required, wounded evacuated per hour, ammunition expended per offensive operation. In the final accounting, 427,584 American trucks and jeeps transformed Soviet warfare. They carried the Red Army from desperate defense to triumphant offense. They made possible the great operations of 1944 and 1945 that drove Germany to surrender. They demonstrated that alliances win wars, that industrial capacity matters as much as military valor, that logistics can be as decisive as tactics. And they revealed, when archives finally opened decades later, that the Soviet Union's greatest victory depended on American wheels, American fuel, American food, and American industrial efficiency. Stalin knew it. Zhukov knew it. Every Soviet soldier who rode a Studebaker into battle knew it. For 50 years, they weren't allowed to say it. But the truth, as it always does, eventually emerged. The Studebaker US 6 2.5-ton 6x6 truck from South Bend, Indiana, became one of the most significant weapons the Allies deployed on the Eastern Front, though it never fired a shot. That's the paradox and the lesson. Sometimes the most important contribution to victory isn't the most dramatic. Sometimes it's a reliable truck that starts every morning, carries its load through mud and snow, and makes it possible for an army to keep fighting 500 kilometers from the nearest railroad. That was the American logistics revolution that Soviet officers admitted they had never imagined possible, and that ultimately helped win the war.